Welcome to the Primitive Lifeways channel on YouTube. I'm so glad you can join me here today. In this video, I'll show you how to locate and track clay in more mountainous, higher elevation regions of central Arizona. So stick with me, I'll be right back with you. We got a great show coming up. Hi everyone and welcome back. So I am actually not too far, probably about 20 meters away from a prehistoric Prescott culture ruin. This ruin is very early in occupation, so it's about 950 to 1,000 years ago. And when I'm looking for clay in the mountainous regions of central Arizona, I'm actually looking close to these pueblos because I'm trying to locate possible clay sources that the prehistoric people used, like I said, 950 to 1,000 years ago. I know that those clay sources work for them, and they will certainly work for me as long as I understand its properties and how to process it correctly. Now, when I'm looking for these native clay sources, I'm looking in wash cuts or road cuts. It's much easier to find a clay body that's naturally exposed compared to getting on higher elevation above the road cut or wash cut and starting to dig into native soil and trying to find clay. It's either hit or miss. So it's already exposed in a wash cut or a road cut. That's really important besides looking next to prehistoric ruins or pueblos. Now I'll be showing you 3 different clay sources in this video that I really like to use. And you can apply this technique and these methods of testing the clay to just about any clay source in central Arizona or higher elevations in the mountains. One other really important thing to understand, these clay sources right out of the earth are not the easiest to work. So you have to let them age. Aging clay makes them far more plastic, so you actually increase the plasticity once you process and slurry the clay. In lower elevations, it's a little bit different. You can just process the clay, add water, and typically speaking, and again, this varies from clay body to clay body, but typically speaking, you can start working them. Now, when I talk about aging clay, I'm just referring to processing the clay. So we gather the clay, we process it by crushing and pulverizing the clay, sifting the clay, slurring the clay, and once it slurries and it firms up, simply letting it sit. Let it sit anywhere from 2 to 3 months. That's really all you need. And you will notice that it increases in its plasticity. So now I'll take you to our first clay location and we'll start running tests. Boy, it sure is a hot one today. So right behind me is one of my favorite clay sources that I gather from in central Arizona, specifically the Prescott area. This is a wingfield wear. It's also a residual wear. So it's a residual clay source, meaning the clay is already naturally tempered. So the temper is impregnated into the clay source within its natural geological formation. Now, the prehistoric Prescott culture that resided here about 950 to 1,000 years ago, they were also using residual clay sources. There's a little bit of a debate between Prescott culture black on gray and Prescott culture gray ware. We know that they were gathering residual clays, but the debate is, were they adding mica to that clay body? In my opinion, no. As we'll see here in a few minutes when we go out towards Williamson Valley, a lot of the earth and the clay bodies out there are naturally micaceous. So it's my belief that they were gathering their clay sources to make black on gray and gray ware from the Williamson Valley area. But nonetheless, with this clay source, I want to show you what you're looking for, how to identify it, how to test it, and some of the natural formation of the geology here. So let's get to digging. Now, when we look for clay, of course, I'm looking in these wash cuts and I'm looking for the texture of the surface, and you can see we have all these crack marks around this clay body. That's a really good sign that there's clay in this formation. But is it good? Again, only digging will tell us, and actually testing. So when clay is wet, it expands. When it dries, it shrinks. When it shrinks, it leaves these crack marks. So this is a really good example. A few days ago, we got rain. We're in a severe drought, so things dry out very fast. And when they dry out this fast, they often leave these crack marks around the clay body. So then when I want to further test the clay, I just take my pick and I start breaking the clay apart. And you can see that it breaks apart in these clumps. That's a really good sign. I'm also examining the clay and I'm seeing bits of temper already impregnated into it, as we mentioned. So another thing that I'll add real quick with residual clay bodies, when you cut into it, it should feel very dense. If it doesn't, and it breaks up easily, that tells me there's more of a fine silt in that clay. And that's okay, it'll still make pottery depending on the clay type. So then I'll just take a little bit of clay and I'll actually add water to it. I'll just work it in my hands and I'll feel it. And this is actually the best way to feel the temper in the clay. So it's starting to stick. That tells me we have good clay, but it feels quite gritty. So when I have the water in the clay and I'm feeling the temper, I can feel that the clay is binding and sticking together. Smell it. It should smell very musky, which this clay does. In the higher elevations, you don't really get a rain smell, you get more of a musky smell with these clays. So it tells me, once again, that we're working with a possible good clay source. The final test, of course, forming a small pot, very easy. You're just pulverizing and crushing the raw clay, adding water to it, and forming a small pinch pot. If it survives, you know it's a good clay to work with and you want to gather more. And here you can see I have plenty gathered. This is what I'm really after today. But we will go to our second clay source now. Now here's my next clay source. This is a bit different. It's more gritty, so it has more temper in it, but nonetheless it is a residual source. This sits not too far from Fitzmaurice Pueblo, and actually I first learned about this from Dr. Andy Christensen, who worked with Tom Weiss in locating this prehistoric Prescott culture clay source. So we believe that the prehistoric people that occupied this area about 850 years ago did gather this same clay source, and we actually matched that up to certain typology of ceramic vessels that we find from the Pueblo, once again not too far from here. So this is a more granitic clay source. It has a gabbro temper in it, and again we're dealing with more temper, but we still have some of the characteristics from our last clay source within this residual body. And I want to show you how to identify this clay source and similar clay sources to this that are once again a little bit different from the previous one. Now when examining this clay, you can see once again we have that crackled texture, so we know that clay is in this body, so that's a good sign. But it's a bit different. This, again, we have more temper within this clay, and as we process it, we have to reduce some of that temper. So with this body, I notice a 45% temper ratio, or even 50% works really well. Anything above that, it gets very, very sandy, and it's a little bit difficult to work with. So once again, we have that crackled texture, as you can see on the surface, and that's our first sign. Now, unlike the previous clay source, this one's much easier to gather from. We can start picking the clay chunks right out of the surface without using a metal tool. Even a simple rock will do to break the clay apart, again, because there's more grit within this clay. Now, this clay in particular, you do have to cut down on the temper like I just mentioned, but also, like all Prescott clays, you have to let them age. When you let them age, they become much more pliable and easier to work with. So all I'm doing is I'm just picking these large chunks right out of this wall. And you can see it breaks off into these chunks. That's what we're looking for. It's not as dense, but nonetheless, I can see and feel that there's clay within this body. So these are 3 pieces that I can work with right away. And like the previous clay, I just add a little bit of water in it, start working it in my hands, breaking it apart. And boy, I can already start feeling it stick together. So it has that musky aroma. That's a good sign. I would further process this clay, form a small vessel, and if it holds up, I would gather more. I would know that this is a good clay that we can use. In my case, I already know it's a good clay. I've used this to form very large jars and oyas with. But nonetheless, if I was new to this source, I would want to test it. And I would even want to fire it and make sure that it fires properly. Just a wonderful smell. Now I'll head up to Williamson Valley and I'll show you that 3rd clay source. This one's much different, much different than these previous 2. Now this clay source is quite difficult to access as it sits on a very steep slope, and trust me, trying to set up video equipment here is not the easiest of tasks. But you can see where we're gathering our clay from. It's a bit different. This is not a cultural clay source, so there's no indicators that I see that the prehistoric Prescott culture were gathering from this body of clay. It does have a similar temper content in the sense that we have a very fine micaceous schist. So this entire clay body is loaded with mica, very fine mica, but the temper is not the same. This is more of a silty body of clay, whereas the Prescott grayware, black on gray, were more granitic bodies. Now as you identify this clay source, once again we have this crackled texture where the clay was wet, it expanded, and when it dried, it shrunk down. And as it shrinks, it leaves, once again, the crackle marks we've been talking about with the previous clay bodies. So as we dig into this, it will break off into chunks. And you can feel, just by breaking it up, it's much siltier. Now the second thing that I'm looking for with a micaceous clay body is the geological features around it. So as you can see on this rock, it is full of mica. You can see that silver sheen. Most of these rocks have mica present. Here's another one. This rock has a lot of mica in it. And another. You can see the mica glittering on this rock. So most of these rocks have mica present. That tells me that the sand and the clay have mica in it as well. Now to further test the clay, I'm adding water and I'm just pulling it together. I'm feeling the body of clay. Of course, I can feel the temper impregnated into the clay. This clay feels really good. It sticks together quite nice. And boy, does it sure have a lot of mica. This is a very micaceous clay body. With just this clump of clay, I can probably roll out a coil and form a test disc. That's how fine this temper is. So once again, we have that beautiful smell, that musky aroma. And I've worked with this clay a lot. I fired it in oxidation, reduction, made bowls, made oyas, jars, so forth and so on, even effigies with it. And it's far different than the previous two clays. It's less dense. So with any silty clay, you have to be careful, especially with paddle and anvil pottery. You can thin this out too fast and you can actually get it too thin. That presents itself a problem. It also has a different color. It's more of an orangish red color, whereas the other two clays were a dark brown. So yeah, each clay body is different, but this one is unlike anything I've worked with up in the Prescott area, the mountains of central Arizona. Hey everyone, so that's just about going to wrap up this video on finding and locating residual clay bodies in higher elevations in Arizona. I hope you learned something. If so, help us out. Give this video a thumbs up. Click the notification bell. Subscribe to the Primitive Lifeways channel on YouTube and share this video on social media. It really helps us to grow, expand, and most important, to hit a wide, diverse audience. If you're interested in learning how to form vessels and make your own primitive pottery, I do have an upcoming workshop on my website. Just hit the classes page and click Primitive Pottery Workshop. That's primitivlifeways.com is where you can find that. Once again, I'm Jeff with primitivlifeways.com. We'll catch you on the next video, and take care.